So today we're going to address the concept of information architecture. And you did some reading. I think you read Rosenfeld paper from JSIST and some of the short pieces, interviews from the ASIS Bulletin from a while back. A good amount has sort of changed and evolved over the last, 7 or 8 years. And so one of the questions you might ask is, is this real? Is there really such a thing as information architecture? If you go on monster.com, and I did this earlier this morning, you get almost 3,500 hits if you just type in information architecture. Now, that doesn't mean there are 3,500 jobs really out there, but it does mean something. And in fact, if you type in lots of other terms, you'll find that this is actually a fairly large number of positions. And there's most major corporations now have teams of information architects. So this is a kind of a becoming more established kind of field. There's an information architecture summit that the American Society for Information Science and Technology sponsors each year. And the first one was in 2000. And this year's summit was in this March, and almost 600 people showed up. So this is a kind of a going concern. Here's the website for that summit. There's also a listserv that ASIS runs, and it's one of their largest listservs. And it's very active, lots of interactions. And then, of course, we have a course here at SILS on information architecture that's offered actually this second summer session, taught by a former architect who then came back here and did her master's degree at SILS and is now teaching the IA course. So, I think it's real, and we'll continue to sort of see more attention to it in the months and years ahead. So, what I'd like to do today is sort of step back and talk about this somewhat abstractly, think about this from kind of a design point of view, and hopefully this will fill in some of the gaps that maybe some of the readings began to form in your mind. So, who does this? And this is really one of the exciting things about information architecture. It's very, very interdisciplinary, and it attracts people from lots of fields. Certainly technical writers do it, graphics artists, real architects, filmmakers, and so on, but information specialists of all sort of shapes, sizes, and constitutions do information architecture. So it's a field that's very sort of open, welcoming, and it gets done for lots of reasons. We try to sculpt or craft or architect, if I can use that as a verb, information for lots of reasons. Maybe just to inform. This could be scholarly, or just could be for the common good, public service announcement kinds of things. Could be for instruction. So we're always trying to craft messages, craft information for some purpose. Informing, persuading, lots of advertising, promotion, selling, controlling people or things. And of course, entertainment is another reason to craft information. And we might just want to create things. Though that's probably one of the less common reasons for doing information architecture. So there's a series of factors that we might want to consider if we're going to think about information architecture. Everything has to be in a context, of course, and so we'll talk a little bit about context. Driven by some sort of goals. This isn't just randomly happening out there. And the sort of three things that typically are considered are the message, the information itself, the audience, who is this sent to, and the media or medium that are used to manage those messages. So the context never sort of sits alone. It's always culturally situated, and it is something that information architects need to think about. So if you're working on a website, for example, then you need to know sort of where that website lives, if you will. If you're working at Bank of America, That's quite different than if you're working at a public library in a small town, in terms of the culture within which that website or that information package lives. Okay? And it's also specific to the audiences as well. And costs are also, of course, always part of the context. You can't get away from those. There are lots of different kinds of goals. I've already mentioned most of them. And there are lots of kinds of messages. The messages themselves, and we're going to get sort of in some more details about this in a few minutes, deal with or are influenced by the actual content itself. What's the nature of the content? What is the domain of knowledge? How is it organized? So history tends to be organized differently than something like, let's say, physics or biology. So history tends to be temporally driven. So dates become extremely important. Whereas in biology, some sort of taxonomic organization becomes very important and drives a lot of the organizational material that you would find in those disciplines. So they matter. The scope, how broad is it? Is it very deep, narrow sort of stuff? Is it sort of very general? Is it for sort of public consumption, general consumption? Or as a Scientific American would say, the intelligent consumer, or is it for some very deep specialists? The complexity is something that relates to scope, whether a relatively common sort of thing like how. A recipe, thank you. Or something that is extremely complex, like the theory of relativity. It's going to matter how you craft those messages. And novelty also matters. If you can assume that the audience has some familiarity with what you're talking about or what you're crafting, then you have a leg up already. If it's totally novel, you have a whole lot of contextual stuff that you need to do. Audiences are important. Who are they? Where are they? Why would they come to this information? What's their knowledge base? If you're talking about creating things for sixth graders, different than if you're crafting something for professional adults. Their experience base is different than the knowledge base. The knowledge is what they sort of know about the topic. The experience is they not only what they have done in the topic area, but also with the system, with the actual either website or medium that you're working in. There's also something that's very hard to determine, and that's the receptivity. Sort of how prepared physically, mentally, and emotionally is the audience for accepting or at least attending to these messages. The media themselves have all sorts of constraints, the technical requirements, of course, which change. Things that used to be really complicated are now becoming much easier. So we really don't have to know sort of the details of HTML anymore to create a web page. But if you really want to actually do a sophisticated web page, then you need to know some other kinds of skills related to the medium so that you can do the fancy stuff that people now expect today that wasn't possible, say, 5 years ago. And that will continue to evolve 5 years hence. The format itself, is it video? Is it on the web? Is it something that's on paper? Is it a sign that's going to be put in a public place? And so on. The number of channels involved, if it's multimedia, which is increasingly useful and actually feasible for common messages, then that's different than if it's a single channel kind of medium. How fast does it get transferred? This has implications for design. So if you expect everyone's got broadband, well, you've now locked out a whole bunch of people from that kind of media decision. And the degree of interaction that's expected. This may have bandwidth implications, but it certainly has implications for the kinds of behavior that you as a designer put into this information that you're crafting. I'm going to do a little bit of history here. So back in the first summit, the Information Architecture Summit, that took place in the year 2000, I was one of the organizers of that meeting and took several SIL students up to Boston with me to sort of help out. And one of the things we did is at the very opening session, what we did was to hand out little 3x5 cards to everybody, and we write down what you think information architecture is. Just, some definition, short, right? Yeah. And then we collected the cards, and instead of having lunch, we sat around and did card sorting and tried to organize all the terms that appeared on these cards. There were, I don't know how many cards, 250, 300 or so. There were about 900 unique terms, and then we sort of tried to cluster them, and we did this all manually, right? And quickly. So here's sort of what came out of that very first meeting, and I know it's a little hard to see here, but you can take a look at it on the website in more detail. There's several dimensions represented here. There's certainly a technical kind of dimension. There's a policies kind of dimension. There's a dimension of standards and a dimension of disciplines. So at this summit, there were people who actually were architects, there were people who were technical writers, there were people who were graphics artists, there were people who were web designers, human-computer interaction specialists, usability engineers, experience designers, all kinds of interesting business cards, sort of titles, and there were a bunch of librarians and people who were very interested in taxonomies or controlled vocabularies. So it was quite an interesting mix. And within each of these dimensions, we sort of saw that people had would talk about sort of the users, and the users could be the end users, or they could be the clients. And in those days, there were a lot of information architects who were basically consultants. So Lou Rosenfeld, who was one of the founders of one of the first fairly successful firms, had about 40 people working for him at one point. When he thought about users, he was thinking about the people who were paying him. So the actual clients, not the end users of the content. And so it's pretty clear that you really had to understand who the end users were, but you also had to deal with the people who you were actually working for. And they had different missions, right? So if the client was a small company that wanted to get its message out, then you had to actually interact with that company, understand their values, what their motivations were, their modes of thinking and operating. But then you also had to try and understand their client base as well, and design for that client base, and explain to the people who were paying you why you were doing it the way you were. Okay, so there was this pretty nice sort of clear split there. There was also sort of some split between the standards and the disciplines, because different disciplines have different sorts of standards. So if you were coming out of a library kind of community, then you thought about things like MARC records and LC subject headings and mesh headings and things, those kinds of standards. If you're coming out of a technical field, you might think of standards like XML or some sort of technical standard for a camera or a computer. Okay? And so those things had to be understood by these people who were calling themselves IAs. We sort of put the information architecture goals in the middle, that this really should be goal-driven, and there was this sort of knowledge-driven versus the data-driven side of those goals. And now, by knowledge-driven, I mean sort of a lot of the tacit knowledge that sort of adults have about how the world works and what might work out there in the world and what might work with these particular people. They're either the clients who you're serving or the end users. And then the sort of data is the actual sort of objects that are going to get stuck into this this design somehow. So this was kind of our synthesis of the kinds of things that different people thought about information architecture back in the day, right, in the year 2000. Now, it's interesting to me that Rosenfeld, Peter Morville, I think this is now in its third edition, Information Architecture for the Web. This is the Rosenfeld and Morville book. Peter Morville followed up with another book called Ambient Findability, which is kind of an interesting one. These guys actually came out of the library school at the University of Michigan. So they were information architects who came out of information science programs. Okay? And so what we see are people coming out of lots of different areas who have been fairly successful in sort of helping to define this new realm. Andy Dillon, who's the dean at the school at the iSchool down at the University of Texas, has written extensively about information architecture and used to have kind of a regular column about it. So there's a lot of contributions that people in our field are making to information architecture. Abe Crystal, one of our doctoral students here, taught our first IA course. He's been quite active in both the summit as well as several other kinds of meetings, and certainly when he gets out there and gets his first teaching job, I'm sure that will be one of the things he'll be teaching on a regular basis. So this leads us to a bunch of discussion questions which we're not going to take the time to delve into now, but I really just want to make the point that designing for electronic media is different. Some things are the same, of course, but there are also some new kinds of things. And so that's the kind of thing I'd like you to be thinking about as we sort of move into this sort of, more design process sort of part of this lecture. How many of you have had the systems analysis class? All right, so this is going to look kind of familiar because it's really just plain old systems analysis with perhaps some new terms attached. So it's really the sort of, define the problem, is it feasible, do the analysis, do the prototyping and evaluation along the way, iterate, and evaluate, maintain, right? So this is standard systems analytic kind of model going on here for this design process. I'd like to sort of talk about something that I'll call the information package. So you might think of this as the content or the message. This is what you're trying to actually, this is kind of the unit that now they're small, make it up, and these things could be words, or they could be images, or they could be a video, or they could be some sort of a little interactive program. They all get connected together into this sort of information package. Probably the simplest way and the most obvious thing to think about from an information package point of view is it's a page. Kind of a web page, if you will, and websites are made up of web pages, right? So that's sort of the basic unit of interest here. We aggregate these packages into these larger architectural creations. Right? So that's really what we're talking about here is how do we build things in a systematic and interesting and useful way. Okay? Nothing sort of too magical here. There's some interesting effects, though, especially for. It turns out that the packages start to get smaller. The units are a screenful. And if you're talking about a cell phone, that's a real small screenful. Even on a large monitor, you probably want to avoid scrolling, so you're trying to pack things onto a relatively small footprint. And this is quite different than, say, a novel or a 20-page article in which you can be a bit discursive and sort of have something that acts as a unit that's relatively large. So smaller packages from the design point of view also means that we're going to have more linkages. And the linkages can be really simple or they can be really complex. So the trend has been toward smaller chunks, screenfuls, driven by the screen real estate and scrolling paging limits. The hyperlinks are the sort of effect that's really, it's a positive effect in that we can actually relate many things to many kinds of relationships if we're clever about it. The trade-off, though, is that having a lot of hyperlinks can lead to cognitive overhead, right, or cognitive load, or that lost in sort of hyperspace or cyberspace kind of effect. So that's one of the things we want to try and watch out for. There's some implications from the way the web has evolved that are really giving some pains to information architects. It used to be that you could design a website in a relatively top-down sort of fashion, like an architect would plan a building. The trouble is that today, at least half of all the entry points to an ordinary website of any type are not through the top page. How are they coming in? They're coming in through searches, and they're coming in somewhere in the middle of your site. Okay, so if you're doing a library website, they're not coming in through that sort of home page saying, you know, hi, welcome to the library. They're coming in somewhere deeper in the site. And that means that as a designer, you need to think a little bit differently about each of these packages sort of standing enough on its own, and yet having the branding and the connections to the rest of the site so that people kind of know where they are and get the message without sort of overwhelming people with having to say on every single page, hi, welcome to my site. So this is a nice design challenge that there's no sort of simple solution for. You might think of this kind of long-term effect as that everything is becoming a little bit more like a reference work rather than a novel. So instead of having these kind of deep, expansive and in-depth sorts of packages, what we have are these sort of small, single-hit sort of things. It's the MTV version of our sort of intellectual diet. And that's probably going to have some effects on us in the long run. Don't know what they are, but it's certainly an interesting thing to think about. How long can you pay attention to something anymore? It's getting harder, isn't it? So a little bit more about these packages. The packages have objects. The objects, and I'm going to use kind of Panofsky's 3 levels of sort of meaning that he defined for art images 40 or 50 years ago as a kind of metaphor here. There's the physical attributes, the size, the color, the shape. Panofsky called these the pre-iconographic sort of level. That these are just the in-your-face. This is, I see it. It's physical, and it's pure perception. Then there's the conceptual attributes, and conceptual attributes have sort of 2 kinds of levels. There's the what things actually denote. The iconographic is what Panofsky called this. The things that you need a little bit of cultural understanding or social understanding, some knowledge about the world to actually make sense of what that word means or what that figure means, that image, right? There's also, though, the connotation. What does this actually mean to you personally or within your group? This is the iconological, and this is the interpretive. This is the stuff that we can never really index because it's extremely personal. This we can attempt to index. This we can certainly index with good metadata here. Subject stuff is what we index here. This is stuff that is the interpretation that is I think, always going to have to be done by the viewer or by the actual consumer of that information package. Right? Now, there's one more thing that these packages have that's quite different than what was possible in the physical world of, say, the book or the magazine. And that's that these objects can have behavior. I think I mentioned this last time. The notion that they can be sort of dependent on conditions, sort of if-then conditions. They can actually have programs attached to them that make them take on some sort of meaning or act in a certain way, dependent on either who you are as the user or what you have just done on the previous screen, or what time of day it is, and Greenwich Mean Time, or lots of other kinds of conditions that might be computable. Right? So this is actually pretty important in what makes the dynamic aspects of the electronic medium in general. Packages also have these relationships, all those lines that connect these things. These are the glue across the subunits. There's the intra-package relationships. So these are the relationships that exist, say, within a website. So next page, go back, go to the top, go to the home page. These are both physical and also conceptual. We have anaphoric references to the previous screen. Well, out of context, that doesn't mean anything. Right? But in context, it means quite a lot. These are the pronouns in linguistics, right? There's also inter-package relationships. These go across sites, if you will. And here, the most sort of obvious physical one would be the citation or the hyperlink. Okay, so those are links across individual separate packages. But there's also conceptual kinds of relationships. These are allusions or metaphors that link out to other kinds of sites. If you go on YouTube and you play around, you'll see there's all sorts of crazy stuff happening. So there was a video that was done by somebody from Bank of America when they sort of merged with another bank, and they took the U2 song "One," and this guy gets up and he sings this, "We're one, the unification of the bank." And then somebody took a cell phone and recorded it, put it up on YouTube, and then there was all these takeoffs. So all these comedians making fun of this guy doing this, and what we're seeing is separate sorts of objects that are now being sort of linked together, in this case, quite literally, because if you find that the one video, it'll have comments and you can just link to them. But other things are not directly linked. They're really more metaphorical. So those kinds of relationships are more subtle, and it's what makes this, I think, all the more interesting so that it's something that isn't going to be machine generatable anytime soon, if ever. So packages also have mechanisms, control mechanisms associated with them. And there are lots of ways to sort of do this. Well, actually, not a lot. There's only a few ways to control display. Basically, you can scroll, you can jump, you can zoom, or you can hover. That's about it. Those are really the only control mechanisms you get, and not too much else possible at this point in time. We also have control that's based upon monitoring, and there's a lot of interesting things here. I mean, histories and bookmarks were sort of the classic kinds of monitoring, but as I mentioned last time when we talked about that sort of proflection notion, there's all kinds of monitoring going on, not just within you in your session, but across sessions that get saved and used to actually make kinds of decisions either about individual packages or about your behavior. We can query, and the queries can be analytical. This is like a nice, crisp Boolean query. Could be with or without relevance feedback. We can do selection, just like menus, pick from a menu, pick list, or we can have sort of dynamic combinations, what we call dynamic queries, in which things like brushing or making selections and being able to go back and see relationships sort of combines the analytic and the browse kind of mechanism. We don't have a whole lot of manipulation capabilities at this point in time. I mean, you can do cutting and pasting, so you can take things, pieces of things, and put it into another object, especially with text. You can do it a little bit with images. We don't have very many good tools with video yet, but that's going to happen. Can you do that with pieces of program code? It's hard, right? I mean, we have reusable software libraries, but it's not quite so direct to sort of just grab these 3 lines and stick them into your code. It's usually a little more complicated than that. Larry here has been working a lot in Second Life, and so how many of those prems that you create are reusable? So, I mean, some of them are really easily reusable, others are much more difficult to reuse. We also can add value in various ways, and here's where I think there's a lot of attention or potential for you to make a difference. What could we add to some information package that would add some value? So, think about a link plot. So, for a website, would it be interesting to see a picture of all the links? How many links are coming into every page? How many links go out? Would that help you understand something about that site? What about a whole series of sites? Can we begin to imagine new kinds of representations that take those packages, do some additional work with the packages, to then make them more valuable? And so that's where I think there's a lot of potential for creative information architects to make a difference. I mean, think about making a concordance. Is it useful to take a book and then have a concordance that goes along with it? Yeah. I mean, if we wouldn't have these things if they weren't useful. But today, any text, you can do that. You should be able to do that automatically without having to spend, a whole year going through counting all the words, right? So this is kind of an automatic, but we don't actually do very much of that. So what's a concordance for a video? What's a concordance for a whole website? The kinds of things that we've sort of done in the past with text, how can we begin to apply those in this sort of new environment? There's also the concept of events. This sort of gets back to that notion of behavior we talked about a little bit. You might think of sort of two kinds of cycles. There's an exchange cycle. This is the classic sort of client-server kind of model, right? In which you do something and something comes back. You smile, somebody smiles back. You do an HTTP request and a page is returned. Okay, standard sort of stuff. And those kinds of cycles need to be carefully orchestrated. Right? You don't want these things to be sort of misinterpreted, or you don't want to send the wrong page or what have you. There's also, though, much more attention in today's world of social networking in what I call the share cycle. The actual cycling of things among groups of people, either usually known, but even sometimes, in some cases, unknown. So forwarding a link to someone, or grabbing something and posting it to your MySpace or Facebook account so that lots of other people can look at it, comment on it, and begin to integrate it into their sort of interpretation of the meaning of the original information package. As the information architect, you don't really have a whole lot of control over this once you put it out there. Is that good or is that bad? Well, I don't know. Could be good. It seems to me that if you want to just control it, don't let anybody see it. But that's kind of silly, right? You really, if you want your information to be out there, you want as many eyeballs on it as possible. And if somebody along the line starts to mess with it, that might be a problem. Or not. Again, this notion of sort of design goes back to sort of our systems analysis with the additional ability, I hope, to leverage interactivity. I mean, half the battle in information architecture, in at least the electronic realm, is to engage people and keep them engaged. So people talk about sticky sites that where people stay at. Now, if you're a search engine, you don't actually want people to be there. You want to get them off as quickly as possible because you've got a server load issue. But if you're a content-bearing site, you want people to stay there as long as possible. And so those are very different kinds of designs because they have different sorts of goals. I want to spend a little time trying to get across this notion of organizational structures. Because if you're an architect, you need to know what are the basic ways you get to lay out the building. You've got some spheres and geodesic surfaces, and you got a bunch of rectangles, and that's about what you have to work with. And you'd be very creative with a very small number of solid figures to work from. In information structuring, we're actually pretty impoverished as well. There isn't a whole lot of structure. We got lists and arrays. Now, an array really is a list. It's a linked list. We have hierarchies, trees, and we have networks. That's about it. It's really just kind of three basic data structures, and we have hybrids of various sorts. I'm sort of curious about the double helix and whether it's really, I think it's more than a linked list. You know, and where the emergent behavior or the emergent properties come is not that you've got these sort of intertwined linked lists stretched out, because that's just dead DNA. But when it folds and you get the three-dimensional bonds between the folds in the DNA, that's where life happens. So something comes out of that. I don't know how to sort of express that in our standard information organizations. I mean, maybe that all happens in our heads when we read or view or listen to these objects. I would challenge you to come up with some other kinds of organizational schemes. So if these are the data structures, here are the kinds of schemes that the architect has to work with from an information point of view. I mean, we can put things in alphabetical, chronological, geographical, you go through the whole list, right? There's not a whole lot else. Strange, isn't it? That, for as long as we've been around on this planet, we haven't come up with other ways to actually order things. All right, now I know, I hope, some of you are going to send me email with the new kind of organizational schema. I always throw this out there. I always get some suggestions, but there are always some variant of these. But maybe, who knows? You can come up with a different kind of organizational schema that could actually help architects have more variability, have more diversity in their toolkits. Control mechanisms or navigational schemas. There's, I think I've talked about most of these, sort of contextualizing people so they know sort of where they are, unless it really is you're just feeling lucky and you don't quite care where you end up. That's important. This goes along with the branding notion. Links are well known. If you're interested in sort of where maybe hypertext is going, go back about 20 years before the web and read some of the early papers where people weren't, the kind of links we have in the web today are really very primitive. They're one-way links, they're not bidirectional, and they're not computed. They're not conditional, but in the early days of hypertext, those were the kinds of links that people were creating and talking about. I think we'll eventually get there. But for today, because the web was created as this stateless, we couldn't have these bidirectional or computed links. Tables of contents, sitemaps, and tours have a lot of possibilities for architects. So if you can give a nice overview of a complicated site, that's a real gift to the world. So, and this is something that people, information professionals, should have some sense about, and I think can actually make a difference in sort of a site or an information package that's used and useful to people. If you're more on the technical side, then you might be more interested in sort of mouse events or sort of animations, zooming kinds of things. But plenty of good, solid, just organizational work to be done here with sitemaps and tables of contents. Finally, a couple of slides here about sort of some of our classic strengths. So one of the reasons that information architecture came out of the information library science realm as much as from any other field is that we've had a lot of experience with dealing with words. Not just creating the words, but in organizing the words and indexing the words and in using the words for purposes of access and attraction. Right? So controlled vocabularies might be appropriate in some cases. On the other hand, social tags that are fully just open and uncontrolled might be more appropriate. The trend today seems to be to providing a little bit of both. Making language clear and concise. It's something that you learn in 8th grade English class, and some of us actually learn about it, and most people just say, oh yeah, right, and go on and sort of get on with whatever the day's got in store for you. And this notion of being crisp, being consistent, using the same terminology throughout the site. It's simple, right? But it's hard to do because a lot of times people just, they create it without much planning, without much control, without much thinking about how this all fits together. That's what the architect is going to do. Architects do, same thing with images and video. The architects do a lot of things, and one of the reasons I think the whole notion of information architecture has evolved, we started with these kind of consultants who were building websites, basically. And today, it's really not just about building websites, it's about crafting messages that are on websites and television ads and the whole projection of image that an entity wants to provide for itself. It could be a huge corporation, it could be a small mom and pop store, it could be you as an individual. But it's a matter of how do you begin to craft this image. And the architect, if you think about what architects in sort of the classic sense do, the architects don't build the buildings. The architects don't mix the concrete. They don't, drive the nails. The architects basically are contractors. They come up, they have a high-level concept, they do high-level design and planning, enormous amounts of planning. They hire contractors. They hire the electrical, the HVAC, the structural folks, the plumbing folks, right? So you really have to know not only how the building's going to work and what that vision is for the building, but you got to actually be able to deal with contracts and lots of people with lots of different personalities and missions and goals and biases and all of that. So the information architect, what we've been talking about in terms of the fun stuff, how do you organize information, how do you be creative, how do you actually sort of craft all this stuff? I mean, that's what sort of gets us into it. That's what we want to do. But to really be a successful information architect, you also have to have the people management kinds of skills that allow you to work with the programmers and the database administrators and the network administrators and marketing and the CEO and all these other people who have some stake in what is going to be this projection of your identity. And so it requires not just the sort of technical and creative skill, but also the managerial, social, political skills to be a successful information architect today. Now, you don't have to go in with all of that. But because Bank of America here in Charlotte has whole teams of information architects. You don't go in as the lead architect without a whole lot of experience. But so you're going to go in probably doing one or two kinds of this work as you learn more about the craft. And then eventually, as a leader, you start to acquire more of those skill sets and then can be the actual lead architect. So this whole sort of range of skills is what we mean by an architect. And part of this eventually gets to the implementation. The entry-level positions are more about implementation. You know about the tools, maybe doing evaluations, how do you maintain things. Almost very seldom are we privileged to actually be able to create something totally new. Usually it's maintenance work. You're taking what is there and you're moving it up to the next version, or you're upgrading some sort of service. Okay? And the various kinds of management tools that we have out there, content management, digital libraries of code, of images, of wireframes, of past practices are things that we've read a little bit about knowledge management. It starts to come in to this maintenance sort of piece of it. So I'm pretty excited about information architecture. I mean, I think it's a going concern. It's a sort of field of study, a field of practice that we in our field have had, I think, a lot to say about and to help define. And it will continue to evolve and change in the future because good creative people like you will perhaps want to get involved in that. Questions? Yeah.
I'm interested in the way you talked about life sort of more as reference instead of novel. I was wondering if you could talk more about that, sort of what you mean by that, and sort of how you feel our interaction with sort of systems reflects our own expectations about communication, sort of like, what I just want to know more.
Well, I mean, it seems that things are getting packaged into more discrete, sort of bite-sized sort of packages now.
Right.
And I think that becomes the expectation, that I don't want the entire website. Just give me the page that has my answer on it. I don't want the treatise. I want the soundbite. I don't want to understand everything about this disease that you just told me I have, but I just want to know, am I going to die so soon? What can I do about it? Just give me the the bottom line. And I think part of this has to do with just the sort of I could say hectic. I could say sort of highly spastic kind of world that we tend to live in. I mean, if you sit at your workstation and just work on a single paper all day long, I mean, that's the way I used to write. But I don't write that way anymore. I mean, I've always got like 10 windows open. I'm doing multitasking and checking email, or I am this, or maybe even going out to CNN to see what's going on in the world, or having some RSS feed sort of alert me to something I'm interested in. And it's a constant sort of juggle, right? And you can't juggle, big boulders. You got to juggle smaller things. And so I think there's a trend toward more atomic-like objects. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I mean, I've started worrying about it, but it certainly is. It seems to me to be what we see more and more of. And if you're a successful information architect, maybe you exacerbate the problem by actually giving people more bite-sized chunks.
Because that's one question I've got is sort of what we've read on the information architecture. It's not so much dealing with information now, but also sort of this anticipatory sort of futures, like that's where everybody is having to look for, they're having to propose models before they can even conceive of what's going to be there. I mean, are there people who look down the road and see that as, that sort of reference idea as being ever expanding, or ways to change that, or I don't know if that's a question.
There are plenty of philosophers who think about the implications of almost anything we do.
Right.
And a lot of them are in programs like this. So I mean, the whole social psychology sort of field tries to understand what our individual behaviors are going to mean for society and vice versa. So sure, there's people who are sort of wondering about this, but it's a very hard thing to control or try to study in a systematic or scientific sort of way.
Gary, I was wondering, have they done any experiments, maybe before and after experiments, where they've seen information interaction apparently change cognitive preferences or cognitive structure? Anybody done anything like that? I've never seen anything.
No. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. My daughter is a neuroscientist, and I keep asking her this question because she reads pretty widely in the literature.
Right.
And are there actual evidences that have come about that can say, oh, look at the brain is actually changing because these kids have been playing video games, or they've been watching television rather than reading, or they've been out playing in the field rather than sitting there reading books, or what have you. Can't find anything. But I mean, changing brain physiology is probably an evolutionary sort of thing, and it's not going to happen overnight. I think what tends to happen is our own behaviors and preferences evolve and change.
I was thinking about what you said about, okay, if they play in the field, they develop physical muscles. Do we know what muscles they're developing when they play in an electronic field?
Well, I think I have seen references to, sort of fighter pilots being better, quicker if they played a lot of video games.
That's good.
There was a educators conference in Second Life recently, and one of the things that came out of that conference was that they did a study whereby they found that people who had an avatar that was more attractive than their real life self became more confident as a person, not only in Second Life, but in their real life. It gets back to the Socratic idea of, know thyself. And if you can change, literally, in this electronic realm, your concept of self, it seems to have effects on you.
Question. It could be that I have an older or biased, I'm a software architect by profession, view of this domain, of this profession, but you seem to have a very broad, much broader view of information architecture than I've ever heard before. We talked about taxonomies and databases and sitemaps and control vocabularies. These are all sorts of things that I'm familiar with this profession, and we leverage them pretty heavily for those areas of expertise. When you start to talk about what's a brand and a commercial and things like that, I mean, you really seem to be in the side of kind of marketing almost. So I'm just interested, where would you, for it to be, it came across to me as it's everything. Any kind of communication is information architecture, and that's probably too broad a definition to be useful. So I just wondering if you could where you draw the boundaries around it.
Well, it's a great question, this book has gotten thicker each edition. I tend to sort of generalize everything, so my definitions are classically sort of very broad because I want to be more inclusive. I think where the actual rubber meets the road is the job. So you might get a job as an information architect, and you're basically doing vocabulary control. And whereas the person next to you is doing wireframe designs of graphic layouts, and somebody else is doing usability testing. Now, are you all information architects? If that's the job title and they're going to pay you whatever salary that you'd like to make, I don't care if they call you an information architect or a usability engineer or an experience designer. It's all part of this evolving kind of world in which we're learning how to do creative acts with new medium. And rather than trying to say, all right, our flavor of information architecture here at SILS is we're going to really focus on taxonomies and do that extremely well, which might be a wise thing to do. I guess I would sort of defend the notion of having this very broad, inclusive sort of definition of information architecture. As long as people understand that the people who are going to actually eventually rise up in those firms and be the lead architects really have to have a little bit of all those kinds of skills. They do have to understand branding. They do have to understand marketing, because otherwise, whatever you create isn't going to make it in the company, or isn't going to be successful. So you need to have a little bit of all those things. So I very much do believe in sort of the generalist point of view. And this, I actually sort of struggled quite a bit about information architecture, and I didn't like the term. So when I came here in 1998, I named my lab the Interaction Design Lab. And I thought information design was a better term. I sort of lost out, and that's okay. I mean, so information architecture, though, is what people have sort of accepted, and it's kind of a profession or a job title that has kind of caught on. But nonetheless, this notion of design is quite broad as well.
I think design, to me anyway, design is a broader term, and when I can see why you were more interested in that being a description of it.
So I don't think I've sort of answered your question, but yeah, it's a point of view. It is a perspective.
Anyone else? Vicky?
How have they improved this within the past few, what new developments?
Well, I'm not sure that there have been new developments per se. I mean, it's things like Ajax, I think, have made the interactions a lot better because you can do things on the client side in a fast sort of action without having to go back to the server. So there's some technical improvements that I think have made information architecture maybe easier in a sense, or given people new avenues. But that's not just a year; that's been sort of evolving over time.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't see sort of a breakthrough. I think probably the biggest change since 2000 is that we've gone from the information architect as the individual consultant. So all these things that you read, these are kind of like one-person operations, or they were, a design company kind of operation, most of which don't even exist anymore. And we've now sort of seen institutionalization of these roles in larger settings. So corporations hire information architects, whereas that was not the case in 2000. So that's probably the biggest change, is that sort of the field has started to actually develop.
Question about we're talking about information architecture as certain specialists who provide a structure, right, that users interact with. Have you seen cases when users are giving direct feedback into altering the system, altering the architecture, so that instead of the user response going through some sort of intermediary that is then reincorporated into a specialized information architecture? Have you seen instances where the user is helping define the information architecture in the use themselves? So does that make sense what I'm asking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in architecture, it's the analog is that you don't put in the sidewalks. You just let people sort of walk, and then where you see a lot of paths being beaten, you watch and you see what's going on, and then you put in the sidewalks. And in design, we usually call that participatory design, and it used to be actually pretty popular. A lot of sort of papers about it, a lot of examples of participatory design, in which the users are actually sort of helping to create the product. Probably the best example of one of participatory design that I think actually works is Alison Druin's work at the University of Maryland with the Children's Digital Library, in which she started to actually work with real children about sort of what do you think about in terms of books, and sort of how do you actually, what attracts you to a book and or a story, and so actually working with those children became very much part of her own research and development effort. We've tried some things. I mean, clearly you want to do your user needs assessment, and I've got a couple other lectures on user needs assessments we've done at the Library of Congress and at Bureau of Labor Statistics with various projects. My own personal experience with this has been you really have to understand your users, but having people actually participate in the actual construction can be arduous. I mean, imagine, I built a garage once, once. Yeah, and I didn't know anything about building a garage. So I got my friends and lots of cases of beer and invited them all over, and we got the lumber and all the stuff and got delivered, and we started to build a garage. This was not a good idea, so I hired a carpenter who sort of came and set us straight about a few things, like you assemble some stuff on the ground, then you pull it up. You don't just start like really basic things like that. And so after a day and a half of working on this garage, and it's starting to take shape, and we're putting the roof on and all this, and the carpenter leaves, and he comes back the next day, and he looks at the garage, and he just turned around and got in his car. Wouldn't let me pay him, had no responsibility, and just took off. And that's because we were doing participatory design, but we didn't know a thing. And so we put the ridge board this way rather than this way. God knows if that garage is still standing today. There were just all sorts of things that end users, are not experts at a lot of things, right? Otherwise, they'd be doing this for a living. So you want their input, you want their feedback, you want to try and involve them, but you can't have them do the task. Otherwise, you're going to have a garage that falls down, or you're going to have an information architecture that doesn't work. And so it needs to be a balance. That's my experience, at least.
Okay, because I was thinking if people are having these sort of greater expectations of how they're supposed to be interacting with information, if that was, possibly considered in terms of maybe not having all users have certain input, but maybe sort of the articles, the interviews that I read for today that talking about, one of the big questions was how do you design an information architecture that is accessible to all user groups, but not specific to one particular one, so that there's accessibility across groups. I was just wondering if maybe there were sort of levels of sophistication in end users that were maybe sort of seen as having a beneficial contribution to the information structure itself. So,
well, Jack Carroll has written about sort of what he calls the training wheels model of design, in which you basically start with fairly simple designs, but then you make a robust enough system so that as people gain experience and expertise, you can start to add new features. Well, no, there are features there, but they're kind of hidden. So that's sort of the classic way to handle that. The other kind of issue you raise is the accessibility issue and sort of universal access, and that's a very tough problem. I mean, if you're in a corporate environment, then you need to obey the law, but you don't have to reach all the population, right? Because you want the population that has money, so you can sort of afford to reach a certain portion of the market. If you work in a government agency or in a public service kind of field, you've got to reach everybody. It's a much, much harder design problem. And so there's not a simple solution. I mean, it really is an ongoing sort of effort. I guess that's another important point about information architecture as opposed to physical architecture. You build a building, it stays there for a while, if you did it right. Whereas information architecture is constantly sort of changing and evolving. It's much more sort of fluid, right? So you can actually, what website has been around for 10 years and not changed? And so it's a matter of establishing a life cycle for design. I used to think that you could do a redesign every year. My own experience has been that's actually too soon. You can do tweaks and you can do sort of improvements and bug fixes and things. But to actually do a major redesign every year is extremely hard for a big organization or a small one. So.
I would argue. I mean, you said what websites have been around for 10 years. I mean,
without having changed.
Yeah, but I would argue that it may not be the architecture that's changed, but it's the appearance. And is that, I mean, you could say that's, the graphic design may have changed. The basic architecture of how to get around and those kinds of things may not change. I guess that depends on what how you define architecture. Is it the broad, general the concepts you've given, or what?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about things like, say, federal government websites, for example.
Right.
I mean, I've probably seen 2 or 3 generations
Right.
of really fundamental architectural changes. I mean, just the way that the underlying systems went from sort of this smattering of web pages, basically, that people built in different departments, to a sort of top-down. All right, we're all going to look alike, and here's the sort of template that you must use. To okay, here's how we're storing our data, and we're going to use a certain kind of search engine to actually make it accessible via search, and we're going to organize our vocabulary in this way. Early on it was just divisions. It was the physical divisions within the agency, and then it became, oh no, let's make it more functional. And for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics never used the word inflation. I mean, that was not a word that, they don't do inflation. They do the consumer price index and the producer price indexes and things of that, very technical things. People say, I want to know what the inflation rate is.
Right.
Well, you could never find anything there in the early days. And so over time, they've had to actually start to use that kind of term and have an organizational schema that is more sort of user-centered. And that's actually been a major architectural sort of change in that agency over a good 10, almost a 15-year period, really. And I think that was pretty conscious. It didn't go all through these changes every year, for sure.
Right.
But over time, they did do major re-architecting of that underlying system, as well as the front end of what it looks like on the surface. In fact, there's probably been less difference on the surface than in what goes on sort of behind the scenes.